Welcome back to U.S. History Blitz. My name is Mrs. B. Gonzalez, and today's video lesson is on the Civil War, battles and events. These are a couple of the key points that we're going to be going over today. So let's start off with secession. In our last video session, we talked about how Lincoln is elected president. And as soon as he's elected president, they know that as a Republican, he's against the extension of slavery to the Western territories. So immediately after his election, South Carolina is the first state to secede. And secede means to break away from the United States. They actually formed the Confederate States of America. They elect their own president, Jefferson Davis, and they also have a capital, which is Richmond, Virginia. Eventually, 10 other states secede and join the Confederate States of America, but we also have border states. And border states are those states that don't want to secede, but want to continue having slavery, such as Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. Those are your border states. Now, the way we're going to remember the battles of the Civil War is through this. Facebook. Two separate words. We're going to use them as two separate words. Facebook always gets very annoying. So again, Facebook always gets very annoying. These are the important battles and events of the Civil War. The face part stands for Fort Sumter, Book, Bull Run, always, Antietam, gets, Gettysburg, very, Vicksburg, and annoying is Appomattox. So remember this, Facebook always gets very annoying, and it's going to help you remember chronologically the important battles and events of the Civil War. So let's talk about the Battle of Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is in South Carolina, which is the first state that seceded, which is actually the first state to threaten secession back during the nullification crisis. During this time, Fort Sumter, their supplies are running low. It's a federal fort, meaning it belongs to the United States of America, and Lincoln decides to send some supplies over. Well, before the supplies can actually even get there, South Carolina decides to bombard the fort and shoot and bomb the fort, and this initiates the Civil War. So the first battle of the Civil War is the Battle of Fort Sumter. Once this takes place, the United States knows that basically it's on. We need a game plan. How are we going to fight this war? And they come up with what is known as the Anaconda Plan. This is for the Union, the North. And the Anaconda Plan basically says this: we're going to wrap around the South and we're going to squeeze them into submission. How are we going to wrap around? Well, first of all their ports, we're going to block them with our Navy. So all this, think about ships, battleships being there, blocking their ports. And you can kind of see them there. They're blocking their ports so that the South cannot export their raw materials to raise revenue, which is money, to buy stuff to fight the war. The next part of their plan is to take control of the Mississippi River. If they take control of the river, they're going to split the South in half, and they can no longer get their supplies like they used to from, let's say, Texas. So that's another part of their plan. And then, of course, let's bring it down and let's squeeze them into submission. Another thing to take into consideration are these advantages and disadvantages that the North versus the South had. So when it comes to population, the North had 24 states. The North was an industrial nation. They had immigrants working there, so their population was very high. The North also had a better transportation system. They had a lot of railroads. They had manufacturing establishments, factories that supplied them with everything that they needed to fight the war. Additionally, they had a navy as well, versus the South, who really didn't have any of those things. The only thing they did have was their plantation systems, their raw materials that they used to sell to foreign countries and get money off of. But they can no longer do that because of the Union naval blockade. Now, keep this in mind though. The South did have motivation. They were fighting for their way of life. They were fighting to defend their livelihood. If slavery ended in the South, how were they going to survive, right? They needed that slave labor. They depended on it. Let's talk a little bit about the figures, the people fighting in this war. Abraham Lincoln was the president of the Union. He was a good leader versus Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, the South. He wasn't necessarily a great leader. He actually really didn't even want to be president during this time. Obviously, who wants to be president in the middle of a war? For the North, you had your commanding generals, Ulysses S. Grant. He was the Union Army leader, but actually, he wasn't the first one. It was actually George McClellan who was the Union general, but Lincoln ended up firing him and put Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant later becomes one of our presidents of the United States. For the South, you had Robert E. Lee. So one of the ways to remember it is Robert E. Lee is for the rebels versus Ulysses is for the Union. So Union, Robert, rebels. And they're rebels because they seceded, right? And Robert E. Lee was actually a great military leader. Lincoln actually wanted him, asked him, can you be our Union general? But when Virginia seceded, he decided to go with Virginia because that was his state. That was where he was from. Let's continue with some other individuals such as William T. Sherman. William T. Sherman was a Union general who actually waged total war on the South. He went from Atlanta, Georgia to the sea to Savannah, Georgia, waging total war. What that means is anything in his way, he'd burn. Railroads, he'd uproot. Telegraph lines, he'd cut. He was waging total war. It was known as Sherman's March to Sea. Stonewall Jackson, a Confederate general, is remembered because of how he defended the southern capital of Richmond, Virginia. Early on in the war, he was able to defend the southern capital by acting by putting his men like a wall and not allowing the Union to get by. If he wouldn't have acted like a stone wall, that's how he got his name, then the Union would have easily been able to capture the capital. The war would have ended in 1861, the same year it started. So as I mentioned, Stonewall Jackson, he was famous for the Battle of Bull Run, where he defended the southern capital of Richmond, Virginia. This is where he lined up his men and he didn't let the Union get through. The Battle of Antietam took place in Maryland, and it's infamously known as the bloodiest battle. And when we say infamous, it's famous for a bad reason, because it had so many casualties. That means so many men died or were injured and later died of their injuries. This battle was actually fought, one of the few battles fought in the North, where Robert E. Lee tried to invade the North. For the most part, the battles were fought in the South, and the South, their military tactic was one of defense, meaning we're going to let them come to us and we're going to defend ourselves. We're going to fight. But in this case, they actually moved up to the North and tried to beat them in the North. And of course, they didn't. After this bloody battle, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. And emancipate means to free. And he said, you know what? We're already in the middle of this. I know I had said I wasn't going to end slavery, but we've started this war. Let's fight for a reason. Let's free the slaves. And so what he did is he freed the slaves in the Confederate States of America only. So think about it. Only in the states that had seceded. Remember that we have border states that have stayed neutral. And so he didn't want those border states to leave and go and join the South. So he only freed the slaves in the Confederate States of America. That was the Emancipation Proclamation. As we continue, there's another battle known as the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, also in the North. So this battle is where Robert E. Lee decides to send his troops to the North and try to fight and beat them in the North. And of course, they don't. They suffered heavy casualties and they end up having to come back down south. So just reiterating, the battles of Antietam and Gettysburg were different because they were fought in the North. So here's Gettysburg, here's Antietam. After all the heavy casualties that happened both in Antietam and later in Gettysburg, President Lincoln thought it was time for him to address the nation. And he goes all the way to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and he makes a famous speech known as the Gettysburg Address. There, he's commemorating the men who died, and they're making a cemetery for all those men who died during that time. But he makes a speech. And in this speech, he starts with 87 years ago. And what that means is 87 years ago, we declared our independence and we started a new experiment. For the first time, we are starting a government of the people, by the people, for the people. We can't let this war end democracy, because that's what we started 87 years ago. We are now not just fighting to end slavery, we are fighting for democracy, for our country, for our government. We cannot let those men who fought the American Revolution and these men die in vain for nothing. So we need to end this, because we're not just fighting for slavery. We're fighting for our nation, for democracy, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Let's continue with the battles. Remember, Facebook always gets very annoying. Fort Sumter initiated the war. Bull Run. Stonewall Jackson defends that southern capital of Richmond, Virginia. Always Antietam. Bloodiest battle fought in the North. Gettysburg. Another bloody battle fought in the North where Lincoln says that we're fighting for democracy. Now, Facebook always gets very. Vicksburg is in Mississippi, and this is known as the turning point, because in the Battle of Vicksburg, it's a siege where the Union bombs Vicksburg for days until Vicksburg surrenders that fort. And once they surrender, the Union finally gets that second part of their plan, which is getting control of the Mississippi River and splitting the South in half. So what do you need to know about the Battle of Vicksburg? Think about the V and splitting the South in half. It splits the South and it cuts the Confederacy in half. They can no longer get their supplies as easily as they used to. Because of Sherman's march to sea, because of the naval blockade, all of these contribute to Robert E. Lee finally surrendering at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. They couldn't go to Richmond, Virginia. It was destroyed. So they went nearby to Appomattox Courthouse, and there Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant, and it officially ends the Civil War. So this concludes our video lesson on the Civil War. We have one more left, and that is Reconstruction. I hope to see you there. Again, my name is Mrs. B. Gonzalez. Thank you for your time.